As billionaires and corporate conglomerates buy up arable farmland, working class people are pushed into a new peasant relationship. All right, guys, hello and welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. I know it's been a little while, but I'm really excited to do this episode with you guys because this is a topic which is really near and dear to my heart. Involves industrial agriculture, the corporatization of farmland, and the means of production for our food systems. And this is, like I said, an issue that has been near and dear to my heart, being someone who lives in a rural Iowa community. I've been on the front lines in the fight against industrial agriculture, against agribusiness, really my entire adult life. My first real cutting of teeth as an activist was when, myself, together with other activists and our community members, helped shut down a meat processing facility that was owned by a huge meat giant conglomerate, Prestige Farms, based out of South Carolina. I've done actions against Iowa Select. This is just, being in a rural community, this is an issue that has been front and center for us. And this is an issue that, affects my loved ones in one way or another, or affects my community in one way or another. So I'm really excited to be discussing this with you guys today. As the name of the video suggests, we're going to be, talking about industrial agriculture. We're going to be talking about billionaire landlords. Of course, you guys have probably heard of this story, or news making the circuit about, billionaires, like as an example, Bill Gates buying up great deals of arable farmland. But more than that, we're going to be discussing, lightly on the environmental topic around this, the environmental impacts of industrial agriculture. But we're going to be focusing more on the economic effects and the class relations that this process has created, right? So we're going to go ahead and jump right into it, guys. I'll try to keep this video as short as I can, but we do have quite a few resources I want to touch on. But we'll see where it takes us, guys. And I'm looking forward to your guys' comments and continuing discussion as we go forward. So we'll go ahead and jump into the reading here, guys, and I'll show you some of the sources we have. This first one we have is from Jacobin. Sorry, give me a sec here, guys. This one's from Jacobin. As you see, we have a few things here. Don't worry. A couple of these are just like quick little tidbits that I'll be showing you, like some graphs and things like that, to add more context. But this one from Jacobin says, agricultural land is becoming an investment vehicle for the rich. So this should be no surprise to you guys. You've probably seen, all kinds of memes and articles similar to this one, talking about how billionaires are buying up large amounts of land. And this article is going to get in to why they're doing it and how they're using this to pad their investment portfolios, right? It says, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't work the land on his Hawaii ranch, but he and other wealthy landowners still benefit from huge agricultural tax breaks. The scheme allows the super rich to hoard wealth at the expense of the general public. So as we go through this, guys, we're going to start with this one here. We're going to talk about land as an investment for the portfolios of investors and, individual rich billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg here. But as we'll go through, we'll kind of pick apart the ways in which they game the tax system in order to make obscene amounts of profits just from holding the land, even if they don't do anything with it. And we're going to be diving into an article here from ProPublica, kind of picking apart some of those tax schemes. We'll move into some current modern day relations of working people with the land and who owns the land in the United States by and large. And at the end, we'll kind of talk a little bit more, about industrial agriculture, its effects, and what it's done to local communities and things like that, right? So let's go ahead and just pop right into here, guys. It says, thousands of acres of farms and pastures once held by scions of plantation-era aristocracy are being gobbled up by new money billionaires and global investment firms. These lands make for appealing additions to an investment portfolio, not only for their prime location and skyrocketing value, but because they are eligible for huge agricultural tax break programs that save landowners millions on their property tax bills. Says here that Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan, who save upward of $300,000 in property taxes each year on their 1,400-acre North Shore ranch, on one 560-acre parcel of land purchased for $50 million in 2021, Zuckerberg and Chan, or the LLC that owns the land on their behalf, get a 90% discount on their property tax bill. 90% property tax bill adjustment. I'm going to go ahead and guess any of us, if any of us own any land, I'm sure it's very few. Maybe you own your house. You have to pay property taxes on that. I'm going to go ahead and guess you probably don't get anywhere near 90% of a tax break, do you? I'm going to go ahead and guess you probably get 0% discount on your property taxes, right? But for a little lot that you have your house on, maybe an outbuilding or something like that. But for his, 560-acre parcel of land that's worth $50 million as of 2021, he got a 90% discount on his property tax bill. Just another way for the rich to avoid taxes in this country, right? And as we'll see, those taxes still have to be paid and they get passed on to somebody else. He gets this 90% discount on the property because ranching occurs on the property. Another 110-acre parcel purchased for $17 million. The couple paid only $730 in property taxes last year on a $17 million 110-acre parcel of land. $730. I mean, I've had checks where I worked overtime where I got that much out between state and federal income tax. But for a 110 acre, $17 million parcel of land, he paid $730 property taxes. Insane. Which doesn't qualify. Okay, it says for scale, owners of a neighboring 5-acre property, which doesn't qualify for the tax breaks, owed more than $7,000 last year, despite the property being valued at less than $1 million for 5 acres. Says a vestige of the plantation economy when the big 5 sugarcane corporations carved up massive chunks of the territory. With a little note here, guys, I mean, I just want to touch on this. So we're talking about Hawaii here, but obviously this goes for all the United States. These big land-owning parcels, these billionaires being able to buy up huge swaths of land, agricultural land and stuff, this is all a result of the settler colonial project that is the United States. And I just want to make a little aside here that it's important to remember, fundamentally all the wealth that capitalists have, that billionaire has, especially some of the older, conglomerates and capitalists, the older families of capitalists, all of their wealth is a result of colonialism. Like this was the starting capital, the free essential capital that allowed, industrial capitalism to arise in the United States and in other parts of the world, right? All of that seed capital is a result of stolen land and human slavery and hyper exploitation. Case in point, here we're going to talk about the Robinsons. I mean, in a lot of these, initial families that were colonizers, WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they still have massive fortunes as a result of colonialism, and a lot of them from the slave trade, hyper exploitation. I mean, you name it. And this goes for, billionaires and capitalists in Europe as well, right? And in conjunction with that, related to that is, some of the biggest billionaires in Germany, for example, some of the biggest billionaires, some of the wealthiest people or corporations in Germany were all Nazi profiteers. And they became some of the wealthiest people in that society, in German society, because of, bankrolling, industrializing, or supplying the Nazi war machine. And by hook or by crook, probably due to the pulling of the strings of the United States empire, those billionaires were allowed, those capitalists were allowed to keep all their fortunes, even though, keep in mind, being them Nazi profiteers, many of them profited from slave labor, from concentration camps and things like that, right? And this is good. This goes for everybody in the capitalist system. I mean, one of the big things going around right now, or in the last year or two, is not Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk's fortune, the capital that he used to start SpaceX and Tesla, or buy up Tesla and all this different stuff, came from the fact that his parents owned apartheid era emerald mines in South Africa. He's South African. That might as well have amounted to pure slave labor during the apartheid era. I realize that they were paid a wage, but let's be honest, we know what apartheid South Africa is. Just another example of this. All the wealth of capitalists comes from slave labor and stolen land. I'll give you one more example of this. George Washington, our, supposed founding father, he was one of the wealthiest men. He came really from essentially close to nothing. Maybe his family had a little bit of money, but in the scheme of, British nobility of that time period, he was from nothing, right? And they always, in history books in the United States, make that out to be like, oh, he's a classic example. Our founding fathers are a classic example of a self-made American man. Okay, yeah, you could say that he was self-made, but he was one of the wealthiest people in the United States by the time the United States was founded, and he made all of his money because, well, they tell you that he was a land speculator or land surveyor. And there'd be like images of him going with his little telescope and his markers and his yardsticks and shit. He's plotting out the course of America, but what they don't tell you is that before the surveying part is he would go up with his local militia or the units that he's in control of and murder all the indigenous people, everybody. He would kill all the indigenous people, sometimes sell them into slavery, and then he'd come back later once everybody was dead, either from disease or from his own guns and troops, and then he'd survey the land, take ownership of it, and then speculate on it back in Wall Street in New York. And that's how George Washington made his money. Anyway, big aside there, guys, but I just want to jump in and point this out, that all this wealth is created from colonialism. This is the seed capital that allowed them, even long down the line, to open tech firms and things like that, right? That's the root of American imperialism, American capitalism. No questions asked, right? Let's go on here, guys. It says, the largest beneficiaries by far are the Robinsons, eccentric descendants of a family that, with $10,000 in gold, managed to buy up about 1/7 of I'm not going to try to pronounce that name. I'm sorry, guys. I don't want to butcher it. And the entirety of the neighboring island of Niihau during the days of the Hawaiian monarchy. Keith Robinson, a self-described quote-unquote right-wing extremist, how nice, who frequently writes rambling diatribes to the local paper about the encroachment of government quote-unquote eco-Nazis. Meanwhile, he's literally a settler colonialist that killed people and duped Hawaiians out of their own land. Calling people eco-Nazis, that's hilarious, is a recipient of enormous government largesse through his preferential tax treatment. In 2022, the Robinson paid just $1,557 in property taxes on a 24,000-acre agricultural property valued at $88 million. Imagine paying $1,500 of taxes each year on $88 million of property that's like agricultural property that produces use value. Insane. Absolutely insane. You can't make these figures up, It's even hard to kind of process them just reading them, I feel like you'd have to fly over in a helicopter and look down at the vastness of it for an hour or two or whatever, and then be like, yeah, this guy pays $1,500 a year on this. How much do you pay a month in rent? Yeah, crazy. And similarly, massive breaks are scattered throughout the rest of their patchwork of land holdings. AOL billionaire Steve Case's development corporation gets a 50% discount on its tax assessment for 2,882-acre agricultural parcel. Billionaire dollar Colorado investment firm Brew Bacall Capital Group cut more than 75% off its assessment for one recently purchased $1,500 acre tract. Everybody's in on this pie, aren't they? Let's go on here, guys. It says every state in the union offers some sort of preferential tax treatment for agricultural land, effectively subsidizing private ownership of farms and ranches. Through an array of borrowing schemes, deductions, and write-offs, the uber-wealthy manage to pay unconscionably low federal income tax rates, with the 25 richest Americans paying a true tax rate of only 3.4%. How much do you pay? Drop a comment. Let me know how much you pay. But reporting on state and local property tax breaks and agricultural tax breaks specifically remains limited. These huge discounts for agricultural land are yet another piece of tax policy that allows the super rich to hoard more and more wealth at the public's expense. Okay, so obviously, pretty clear what we're getting at here. All this stuff where you see Bill Gates buying up land, all these billionaires buying up land, it's a series of tax schemes a lot of times. There will be deductions for allowing ranching on the land, for like allowing cattle and things like that to graze on the land. They won't use it, but they'll get, like we saw, 50%, 75%, 90% off their tax adjustments just for letting some cows graze on their land. Another one that we'll get into a little bit with some other source material is they will abuse conservation easements. And conservation easements were meant to be set up that, like, if you donate a certain amount of land to an organization or, permanently allocate it to be wild area, ecological area, you'll get a big tax rebate on the rest of your land that you own, which, we could debate that, but it's a decent policy. It's allowing it to be used as a public space for wild ecosystems and stuff like that. But as we'll see later in this IRS article from ProPublica, they completely abuse it, and they form land trusts, which land trusts are supposed to be a positive thing, but they'll use it to essentially speculate on the land in the form of tax deductions. It's pretty crazy, guys. But so I want you guys to consider with this segment the amount of money that they are not having to pay in taxes, right? Or having outright subsidies paid to them by the government for using the land this way or not using the land at all or whatever. And then consider what that tax revenue could be used in the form of land conservation or in the form of sustainable agriculture. I mean, all this money that's just going straight into the offshore bank accounts of billionaires could be used to completely reimagine the United States agricultural system and move it away from industrial agriculture, move it away from cash crop agriculture to regenerative agriculture, to, subsidizing crop diversity. One of the main things you see living in Iowa, it's all there isn't even wheat anymore really for bread. It's just sometimes you'll see some sweet corn. Not very often. You'll usually see corn for animal feed, for industrial meat production, or you'll see soybeans and more corn for ethanol production or the creation of food oils, right? And all this beautiful land that we have in Iowa. Iowa's actually one of the number one changed landscapes anywhere on the planet. When settlers first came here, Iowa was all wetland and prairie, incredibly beautiful. You can read accounts of settlers and native people in the early days of whites coming to the continent across the Mississippi River, where there was so many waterfowl. That's ducks and geese and things like that. There was so much waterfowl that when they took flight towards the end of the year, when they'd fly south for the winter, it would become dark out. Like they said, it would almost be like night because they'd block out the sky. That's how much waterfowl there was. So Iowa is one of the most changed landscapes on Earth, and it's some of the most fertile land on Earth, more fertile even than the Fertile Crescent in Babylonia. And all this beautiful, highly productive farmland. I mean, if you've ever been to Iowa, I don't know where you guys are from, the soil is black with nutrients. I mean, it's unreal. I've had people come and visit, family members and stuff from the South, where you guys got a lot of that red and gray clay, and they're, the younger kids, they like, why is the dirt black? Anyway, and all that highly productive land, 95%, I feel like, if I remember the statistic correctly, of Iowa's land is farmland or arable land. It's all used to feed industrial meat and produce ethanol and food oils, like that you fry your fucking chicken in and shit like that. Absolutely crazy. So all these tax breaks, I'm getting on a side here again, could be used to, subsidize the growing of tomato, all kinds of foodstuffs, any foodstuffs you could imagine. We can grow almost all of it except for some of the citrus fruits and tropical fruits here in Iowa. And yet none of those tax breaks is used for that. It's just used to line the investment portfolios of land tax breaks for billionaires. We could be using it to, that tax revenue to repatriate the land into wetland, into prairie to help, stave off or even potentially reverse climate change. It's important to remember, in line with this, that all economies are planned. You'll hear a lot of discourse about, socialism doesn't work because it's a planned economy. Capitalism works because it's a free market and it's the laws of the market make everything happen. It's not planned. That's a complete lie. That's a complete fabrication. That's a complete half-truth. I mean, that's an illusion. Every economy throughout all of human history, including right here in the wild, wild west of late-stage capitalism, the United States of America, is a planned economy. Okay? It's planned like this to have tax breaks for billionaires on agricultural land. It's planned to have a million loopholes for offshore bank accounts. Everything is deindustrialization of our society is planned. It's planned by the financier capitalist class, right? Every economy is planned. And we could be planning our agricultural system to be sustainable and highly productive for nutritional content, and to repatriate land to help stave off climate change, but we don't. We've planned the economy to be centered around padding the accounts of rich people, right? Just a little aside there, guys. So going on with this here, it says, saving the family farm. Property tax rates began appearing in the late 1950s as rampant suburbanization inflated the values of agricultural land, leading to concern that small farmers would be pressured into selling off to developers. Over the ensuing decades, states and counties steadily began adopting the policy of use value assessment, which artificially deflates the taxable value of farmland, often by more than 90%. The push for use value assessment as collaboration between the environmental movement and pro-farm groups, quote unquote, the idea was that they would be pro-family farms and address concerns about green space and urban sprawl, she told Jacobin. So what we see here is initially, and who can say what happened in the smoke-filled rooms, but initially the idea behind these easements that these billionaires are abusing was, one, to protect small family farms that have been in the hands of those small family farmers since at least the 1848 Land Grant Homestead Act, right? And it was also in conjunction alliance between environmentalists who wanted to preserve ecological systems and open wild spaces, right? This was like both of those types of groups got together, formed alliances, and realized that these sort of policies would be positive for us. And then I'm sure by IV trickle and hook and crook and all the smoke-filled room espionage bullshit, over time it was gradually changed so that it really became nothing more than a tax break for some of the largest corporate industrial ag conglomerates and investment portfolios, right? I imagine it was done with this veneer of talking heads and PR dudes talking about it's still for family farms. I mean, obviously. So that's where this all came from, but now we've inherited a situation where it's been completely warped from its original purpose, which is so much of the legal code in the United States anymore, right? Says here, a 2015 report said that the policy in helping preserve small family farms is weak at best. The report points to the fact that American farmers are now often owned by higher net worth households as possible evidence that the tax breaks haven't been saving small family farms, and that the farms have instead been consolidating into wealthier hands. And this is one of the key points that we are going to be discussing more in depth a little later on, how all of this land is being bought up, not just by billionaires, but giant corporate conglomerates. And the people that for generations have worked the land are being pushed off the land or being pushed into a sort of modern day sharecropper serf and lord of the manor relationship, a neo-peasant relationship, right? And we'll get into that more later. Farm operator households make a higher median income than U.S. households, and their median wealth is more than double, 2.1 million in 2021. So this is a statistic showing how, there's this propaganda and imagery of the yeoman American farmer feeding America, feeding the world. Increasingly, that is not becoming the case. Increasingly, the farmer is becoming a sort of lord of the estate, lord of the manor, who owns huge swaths of land, is worth millions of dollars in net value, and who, by and large, oftentimes, if he's not an owner-operator, does not, work the land himself. He rents it out to other potentially smaller owner-operator farmers, or people that even live in urban areas that come out to do the farming because they own no land of themselves. I mean, this is like the definition of a peasant relationship, right? Going on here, guys, says, what is clear is that the loss of tax revenue can have a brutal impact on cash-strapped local governments. No surprise. This is something all of our communities deal with, right? Taking huge bites out of state and county budgets. Public schools, which are often funded through property taxes, are especially hard hit. The United States is one of the only modern countries in the world that uses property taxes to fund its public education. And that is done on purpose, one, for the super wealthy and wealthier, in general, citizens to avoid taxes, but also has, many of you may already know this, racist undertones. And it was a way to keep, black and people of color students undereducated and give them less access to resources and opportunities, because obviously, historically, systemically, colored communities had less, they owned less land. The land that they owned, the property that they owned, was fundamentally smaller than the average, white working class family. And so as a result of that, they were able to pay less in property taxes, and then that means they had less resources for education, and it becomes a cyclical thing, right? So some racist undertones there as well. Let's see here. It says, the use value appraisal of farm, ranch, and forested lands reduced the property tax base in Texas by more than $2.9 billion in 2013 dollars. I mean, guys, that's an astronomical amount of money. $2.9 billion in Texas for the year 2013, because of these sort of tax loopholes and the way that its original purpose has been warped to benefit the super wealthy. What could small communities in your state do with $2.9 billion? I mean, that's a lot of, like, you could build whole schools. You could build whole schools and hospitals for those sums of money. Lots of them. I mean, that's $2.9 billion. That's enough to build a, light rail system in several communities. It's enough money to build thousands of acres of public parks. I mean, just crazy. You can't even imagine it. But instead, that $2.9 billion that is meant for community members is siphoned into the pockets of people who own land in that community, but who may not even be a part of that community. It's a vacuum, right? Going on here, guys, says the lost revenues must be replaced by higher taxes on other, usually poorer people, or cuts to social services. On an island facing a massive housing crisis, the median home price often tops $1 million. Because they've turned Hawaii, I mean, this is the same with Puerto Rico and, islands in the Pacific and stuff. They've turned these areas into amusement parks for white tourists, where they sell off access to the visuals of the sea or to the wild places for, $6,000 a week or whatever, right? Meanwhile, the native and indigenous people, they don't have access to that. They don't get to enjoy a lot of the inherent beauty of their own homeland, right? Affordable housing projects often find themselves wanting for that missing funding. Yes. Meanwhile, housing there for some of the settlers, I'll even call them settler colonialists, $1 million homes or more, probably way more. Meanwhile, can't even build project buildings for poor and working class people who live there and work there, right? Compare this to the cuts made in this month's debt-stealing theater piece. The increased age for work requirements for SNAP recipients will save just $6.5 billion over 10 years. There's a lot more money to tap through reforming tax giveaways than by cutting already bare bones welfare programs. Before we go here again, we'll just point this out. To people that think trickle-down economics work, okay, first off, you're damn near hopeless probably if you are still pitching that fucking line. We obviously, none of us are seeing that wealth. And two, again, people get so upset over welfare programs and things that actually help working class people. The people in your community, your friends, your neighbors, your schoolmates, your colleagues at work, they get mad about them getting assistance, but they'll have no problem with any of these guys who own huge swaths of land. Keep in mind, do you own land? Probably not. Getting billions of dollars in tax easements or subsidies, checks cut by the U.S. government. They don't have any problem with that. I just have never understood the disconnect with people with that. And even sometimes they've been so propagandized to believe this stuff that even sometimes when you talk to them and you see they kind of get it, they're like, oh, yeah, I understand. But then they'll come back, but still, I don't think a guy who doesn't work should get food stamps. It's like, you just want to smack your head, you know what I mean? All right, guys, let's blow through the rest of this article here. It says, trickle-down tax breaks. Large landowners generally lease part of their land to actual farmers or ranchers whose work makes them eligible for the tax break programs. Again, coming back to that, landlord-to-serf relationship. About 40% of all agricultural land and a majority of cropland in the United States is rented. 40%. This is not a nation of landowners, obviously. So we got a quote here. It says, you're paying $150 in rent on 3 acres, and you can sell a cow for $500. You're basically making $350, he said. But that's not including your medicine, your tags, your branding, your feed, your vaccines. The profit margin is not that great. These leasehold farmers will become more common in coming years as agricultural land gains popularity as an investment vehicle for corporations and billionaires. Big investors began taking interest in farmland in the early 2000s, and it became a particularly valuable asset in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, as the wealthy scrambled for safe places to stash their money. Agricultural land is sought for its stability and steady increase in value, along with the fact that, due to climate change, it is projected to become increasingly scarce this century. I mean, how fucking dystopic, you know? That agricultural property taxes can be next to nothing certainly contributes to that appeal. Though land held by investors doesn't yet make up a huge percentage of total agricultural land, the amount of investor-owned land has certainly been growing to the extent that young farmers looking to buy land are being priced out of the market. This is the very same process that has happened in urban centers for, regular working class people in urban centers, where you have real estate speculators coming in and buying up all the housing, all the single family homes for people that want to buy their first house, all the apartments and things like that. And then they price it so high that nobody can fucking afford it. And then you wonder why you have thousands of people living on the street and there's literal tent cities on like Hollywood Boulevard, right? Same process is happening on the land, only instead of it creating homeless people, it's creating a whole peasant class of farmers that farm the land, but they do not own the land, right? Going on here, says part of the rationale for preferential tax treatment of agricultural land is the hope that the tax savings will, quote unquote, trickle down to leasehold farmers in the form of lower rents. As we know, that never happens. Does this pan out? Maybe sometimes. There is no public oversight on those decisions. It's true that Zuckerberg's local donations are probably worth more money than the island could realistically make by fully taxing his property, but relying on charity is an unreliable and undemocratic way of funding social goods and services. More important than the total dollar amount is clawing local funding decisions back from private interests and into the public domain. Whether to fund housing or education or support leasehold farmers are choices that should be made by the people, not millionaires and billionaires that happen to own the land. So obviously this comes to a classic argument. Somehow in this country, people associate billionaires being able to own huge amounts of land, being able to own all the factories, being able to make all these decisions, and then on occasion giving, doing philanthropy, doing charitable donations as democracy. Somehow in their mind, a handful of billionaires that own everything and being able to make all the decisions for output and production and everything is democracy. Meanwhile, they do not see tax revenue being used in the public sphere that is democratically accountable as democracy. It's democracy when a billionaire can own your entire fucking community and then give you a little bit of money back as a charity to open up a, I don't fucking know, food bank. That's democracy. But everyone collectively owning the land, owning the factories, and democratically deciding together what to do with those things and how to use the money that's produced from it is not democracy. Somehow that's authoritarianism. There's this complete mental split, and obviously it's a result of, centuries of propaganda and misunderstanding. But I just, once you lay it out, it becomes increasingly clear. Capitalism is not democracy. Private ownership of the means of production is not democracy, and it never will be. In fact, it's counterproductive. It is completely counter to democracy, right? So that's the end of this article here, guys. But I do want to touch on something here. It talked about, conservation easements and stuff like that. And you'll see memes like this one here. I'll pull up for you guys. You guys have probably seen memes like this one, right? Let me just minimize this, pull it over here quick. Right? Where it says, way more impressive than billionaires racing to space. Swedish millionaire Johan Jalask purchased 400,000 acres of the Amazon rainforest from a logging company for $14 million for the sole purpose of its preservation. And so you guys have all probably seen stuff like this over the years. And it paints billionaires as people committed to stopping climate change, as committed to land conservation and shit like that, right? But when you dig a little deeper, and especially to the relation to the conservation easements we're talking about, we realize that is not why they're doing this. Obviously, as we've already seen, one reason why they're doing it is for tax easements for other reasons. But there's also stuff called conservation easements. And a little more information on this specific guy says here, according to a 2008 report by the New York Times, while Eliask's intentions were to conserve the forested land, the Brazilian government and locals were wary of foreign buyers. Drawn by Brazil's housing and biofuels boom, many foreign investors would skip around rules restricting their ownership by buying Brazilian companies, purchasing through them. So again, this is a foreigner coming in and buying land that belongs to Brazilian people. And again, going back to my last comment I made, I don't understand how people see this as democratic or see this as being awesome. Well, wow, this guy's preserving land. But if the government does it, it's somehow authoritarian. If democratic decisions are reached and then that is the decision, is to conserve land, somehow that's authoritarian overreach. But a single individual worth billions of dollars owning millions of acres of land or whatever it is, and he says, keyword, says, he's using it for conservation. Somehow that's awesome. I mean, the disconnect is unreal. Going on with this, it says, in 2008, the Brazilian government announced a fine worth hundreds of millions of dollars and began investigating the lumber company by Elias for alleged illegal logging. Elias, however, denied any irregularities. The company argued that the logging activities were in accordance with environmental guidelines occurred before the change in ownership. So he lied. He's using it for logging. You can't trust what billionaires tell you. I shouldn't have to explain that, right? It's just crazy to me. It's just crazy to me the way that billionaires are held up on this pedestal. I mean, they're thieves and liars, and people buy it up hook, line, and sinker. And obviously the media and Hollywood and shit doesn't help with that anyway. They have fucking, what do you call those, docu-series or biopics about Steve Jobs or fucking Mark Zuckerberg. It's just crazy, right? But going along with some of these tax breaks and how people associate it with them trying to do land conservation, we're going to get into one of these schemes here, right? It says the IRS tried to crack down on rich people using an abusive, quote unquote, tax deduction. It hasn't gone so well. Hold on. Of course it hasn't gone so well because billionaires own the government and the IRS and the actual people that are in the government that would maybe like to hold these people accountable have zero fucking power. All right, let's see what this is about here, guys. It says the scheme they're trying to kill is what's called a syndicated conservation easement, which the IRS calls abusive and says has resulted in bogus deductions for the rich that have cost the U.S. Treasury billions in revenues. A conservation easement, in its original legitimate form, is granted when a landowner permanently protects pristine land from development. In that scenario, the public enjoys the benefit of undeveloped land, and the taxpayer gets a charitable deduction for their other land. Okay, seems fair. By contrast, the syndicated form, created and packaged by profit-seeking middlemen known as promoters, involves buying up land, finding an appraiser willing to declare that it has huge development value and thus is worth many times the purchase price, then selling stakes in the deal to wealthy investors who extract tax deductions that are often 5 or more times what they put in. So that's what a lot of these billionaires in corporations and things like that, investment firms buying up huge amounts of lands and then saying it's for conservation is really about. It's a complete fucking scam, and then it's marketed through PR and philanthropic facades as being, oh, we're saving the fucking forest or whatever the hell it is, right? Complete lie. Again, don't trust billionaires. Going on here says, boy, it isn't, this is from an IRS guy, says, boy, it isn't like the old days when people were fearful of the IRS, said Stephen Miller, who oversaw enforcement in tax-exempt organizations during his 25 years at the IRS and is now a national tax director with consulting firm Alliant Group. I'm worried people aren't afraid of the cop on the beat anymore because they're not. Because they know that the government that is in control of the IRS is in the pockets of the billionaires. So, of course, they're not going to come. They'll come for you and take away everything you've worked for all your life because you missed $900 on a tax appraisal or some shit. And then they're like, oh, well, that's worth $32,000 now due to fines and back taxes. But they will never go after these guys doing, I mean, it's just crazy. Some promoters continue to flaunt their sales pitches. In November, for example, in Alabama, promoter solicited high net worth clients with an ad in Barron's promising in capital letters tax deductions available through conservation easements. $100,000 invested yields up to $600,000 in deductions. And sizable deals are still being struck, including by Atlanta firm called Ecovest Capital, a chief target of the Justice Department lawsuit. So this is what they do, is they buy up all this land, they set it aside, quote unquote, for a set period for conservation at an artificially appraised easement, and then once they've collected all those deductions for as long as they're allowed to, then they sell it all off or they develop it. So the land ends up not being conserved anyway in the long run, right? It puts it off maybe for a little while. And the point is, these tax deductions could be used to actually repatriate the land, redevelop wild spaces, redevelop green coverage, but instead it just goes, the tax deductions just go into a private investment firm and pad, once again, the pockets of billionaires. The Justice Department suit, which is still in its early stage, asserted that Ecovest has been involved in 51 syndication easement deals since 2009, generating $1.7 billion in federal tax deductions. What could $1.7 billion do if it was actually used at a federal or a community level to actually advocate for conservation of land? Right. I mean, I think that's, yeah. I have a little bit more here, guys, but I mean, you guys are getting the idea about this. I mean, this is what these memes and things like that about billionaires buying up land to save the planet is about. It is not about that. It is not about that. And all you're doing by advocating for that or being on the side of that is putting the land in the hands of billionaires for some PR facade and taking it out of your own democratic control. That's what it's about. All right, guys. So for this next segment of the video, we're going to get more into industrial agriculture and how, corporate food producers, rather than just individual billionaires lining their investment portfolios, have been buying up, large amounts of the farmland. And if they aren't buying it up, are kind of using their scale and political and financial resources to, regardless of buying it up or not, push farmers off the land, push them into lower pricing. And we're going to kind of examine the sort of effects this has had on, rural communities. And, kind of try to tie off the end of the video with this, talking about, what will this look like in the future and what are some alternatives to this kind of system, right? So let's go ahead and jump into the reading here again, guys. Double check this quick. It says, so we got this article here. This one's from The Guardian. Says, how America's food giants swallowed the family farms. And again, this is something that, I've been on the front lines with my entire life. I've heard so many testimonies. And actually, one of the guys quoted in this article is a guy I know personally and I've done some activism with over the years. So it's pretty cool. But yeah, this is something that we live with here. The amount of people, every time you talk to somebody who actually does own farmland, they talk about how increasingly hard it is getting to compete. And you'll also, a lot of the people that I know that work the farmland, they don't even own the land. They don't even live in the rural communities near the land. They live in like somewhat bigger rural communities in hubs like Mason City, where I live here in North Iowa, and then they travel out to work the land, right? So let's go ahead and get into this here, guys. It says, across the Midwest, the rise of factory farming is destroying rural communities, and the massive corporations behind this devastation are now eyeing a post-Brexit UK market. Within each square, generations of families tended pigs and cattle, grew oats, and raised children, with the sons most likely to take over the farm. That is how Barb Kalbach saw the future when she left her family's land to marry and begin farming with her new husband, Jim, 47 years ago. When we were first married, we had cattle and calves, she said. We raised hogs from farrow to finish, and we had corn, beans, hay, and oats. So did everyone around us. Half a century later, Kalbach surveys the destruction within the section of chessboard she shared with other farmers near Dexter in southwestern Iowa. Barb and Jim are the last family still working the land, after their neighbors were picked off by waves of collapsing commodity prices and the rise of factory farming. With that came a vast transfer in wealth as farm profits funneled into corporations or the diminishing number of families that own an increasing share of the land. Rural communities have been hollowed out, and while the Kalbachs have hung on to their farm, they long ago abandoned livestock and mixed arable farming for the only thing they can make money at anymore, growing corn and soybeans to sell to corporate buyers as feed for animals crammed by the thousands into huge semi-automated sheds that now dominate farming and the landscape in large parts of Iowa. So I don't know where a lot of you guys are from. I'm assuming some of you are from rural areas, but if you drive through rural areas, one of the things you'll see is these huge industrial size, they just look like industrial sized sheds. A lot of times they're one story. Some of them, though, anymore are 2 or 3 stories. When you see those, a lot of times you'll smell them before you see them. You'll smell pure ammonia, pure smell of hog shit. Stinks. It gets stuck in your car, starts recirculating with the air. Just know, if you're not familiar with those are CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. There will be hundreds or thousands of chickens or hogs in those facilities, right? And this is obviously fundamentally different than for how for years, animal agriculture, for most of human civilization, animal agriculture was done, where, you have barns. A lot of times the animals are out in the open. Nowadays, a lot of those animals, a lot of that pork, a lot of that beef, a lot of that chicken never even goes outside. In fact, a lot of times they'll never even come in contact with a human being, except for rarely, because a lot of it's all done by computers and automation now. And the problem with that is, when you have regular farming practices for meat, the animals are spread out over the property, right? So when they go and, defecate or pee, it's being spread over a large area where it can kind of be reabsorbed in a somewhat natural way back into the environment, back into the soil. That's not what happens here. These animals, they shit and piss all over the floor, right? And then it's hosed or funneled into these huge tanks. And then a lot of times these huge tanks are dumped into reservoir pools, right? That are literally pink in color because of the like biomutant fucking algae that's created from the large amounts of nitrates. And then, sometimes it'll be sealed in the ground where it can leak into the water supply, the aquifer underground. Other times it is taken and then sold as fertilizer and sprayed all over the fields. And as a result also, and I'm going to kind of jump around here, as a result also of, growing exclusively corn for animal feed for these industrial meat production outfits, capos, or for growing ethanol. The corn is also used to produce ethanol alcohol that goes in the gasoline, or it's also used for food oils. Because of the sort of cash crop form of agriculture where we're not growing actual foodstuffs anymore, it also provides an incentive to rip up as much land as possible. So you can kind of actually see it in this image here. You can see this little like line of trees. If you go through areas, I'm sure you've seen it. Maybe some of you are urbanites, so you don't see this kind of stuff. But all this stuff, and you'll see it along the ditches and stuff, trees and growth and stuff, it's there to stop runoff from fertilizer from getting into the drainage dikes and then going into our rivers and waterways. Nowadays, due to ethanol production and animal feed production, it's incentivized to rip all that up because every single square acre, if you rip all that up, you can maybe get like another acre or two of corn for a cash crop. And because of the low prices that even the smaller farmers are being forced into, they are kind of compelled to do this as well. So then you have no longer any buffer of wetland or hedgerow or small, forest copse to filter out the waste, so it just goes straight into the drainage dike, straight into the river. We have such a huge nitrate pollution problem from the fertilizer that it's giving people, higher chances of getting cancer and stuff like that. In fact, I don't have the statistic here now, but I believe I read one time that in certain counties, if you're a woman living in a rural county that gets your water from the wells have large times been so polluted by nitrates, you have like a 1 in 4 chance of getting breast cancer now. So that's how bad this problem is, right? So there's huge environmental impacts on this as well. We have 760 waterways in Iowa that are completely destroyed. We have fish kills all the time. Absolutely crazy. So there's environmental impacts as well as social impacts to this as well. So let's go on with the reading here, guys. It says, now the land is rented out and is all given over to corn. A little further along, the Watts family's farmhouse stands empty, its roof falling in. There are a few relics of the old farm at the place that used to be owned by the Williamses, an abandoned hen house, and a bit of machinery. But the land is all corn and soybeans. The Denning house on Walnut Avenue was bulldozed after the land was sold and rolled into a bigger operation. It's a story replicated across America's Midwest, with the rapid expansion of farming methods at the heart of the row over U.S. attempts to erode Britain's food standards and leave or open access to the UK market. Woody Johnson appealed to UK to embrace U.S. farming practices, arguing that those who warn against practices such as washing chicken in chlorine, that's your chicken McNuggets, boy, have been deployed to cast it in the worst possible light. I mean, beyond just environmental impact, beyond just social impact for human beings, I'll be honest, like, I'm not a huge animal rights guy. It's not that I'm not, it's just that on the scale of like environment and human relations, animal rights, take a lower precedent to me than maybe some of those other issues. Maybe you guys know more about it or want to pitch an argument at me. I mean, I'm not closed-minded to it, and I'm not deaf ears to the suffering of animals. Don't get me wrong. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is also there's a huge animal rights issue with this as well. I mean, these slaughterhouses are absolute horror show. You guys have probably seen stuff about it now. And then we have a map of Iowa, where I'm from, guys, here. In case you're wondering, I'm up here in the middle north. Anyway, going on here, guys, says, in the past 20 years where I am, independent hog farming just silently disappeared as the corporates came in, says Partridge. I live on a hilltop. I can see 7 farm families, people my kids went to school with. They're all gone now. My county has 11 small towns, and it's almost like I could look back in slow motion and just see the businesses change and disappear. We've become poorer. Our communities are basically shattered, and in more than just an economic way, in a social way too. So, something there, guys. It's for, people that are all about family values and the American way and stuff like that. I hate to break it to you, but your way of life has not been destroyed by LGBTQ people. It has not been destroyed by black people. It has not been destroyed by immigrants or by welfare. It has been destroyed by corporate domination of your entire life. That is what has destroyed it. It is corporations like Walmart that have destroyed the small businesses in your community. It is corporate giants like Tyson Smithfield that have made it so that the family farmer barely exists anymore. It is things like this. It is giant corporations like this that have completely hollowed out your communities. Okay? And you need to realize that if you're for traditional family values and all that, fine. I don't care. You be for traditional family. Anyone that you think is against your traditional family values, like gay people or whatever you think it is, they don't care that you have traditional family values. No one wants to change your traditional family values. They just want to live their own family values, right? You need to realize that the same people that are trying to destroy those groups of people are trying to destroy your way of life too. That's a fact. And it's giant corporations and capitalists, right? Going on here says, this collapse has in good part been driven by the rise of concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, like we were talking about. In these industrial farming units, pigs, cows, and chickens are crammed by the thousand into rows of barns. Many units are semi-automated, with feeding run by computer and the animals watched by video, with periodic visits by workers who drive between several operations. That's how I ended up with 40,000 hogs around me, says Partridge. We have... what is it? I think we have... So something else I want to paint for you guys here in Iowa. You know what? Maybe I should look this up quick because I want to have the actual statistic. Let's see. How many hogs in Iowa? Bear with me. Okay, yeah. On September... Here, we'll pull this up for you guys. What's going on here? Okay. On September 1st, 2022, there were 23.4 million hogs and pigs on Iowa farms, according to the latest USDA National Agricultural Statistics. Okay, there's 23.5 million hogs in Iowa. There are 3 million something people in Iowa. Insane. So, and I want you to think about something. I want you to visualize this when I'm talking about the waste produced by these animals and what it does to our environment. Here in Iowa, we have 3 million people, right? Those 3 million people, they shit and they pee and they puke and whatever into a toilet, okay? That toilet gets flushed and then it goes through a wastewater treatment facility where it's either after that dumped into a local river or repatriated back into the water system so that we can drink it or use it for cleaning or washing or irrigation or whatever, right? 3 million human beings that shit and then have their shit processed and then whatever, right? Hogs shit way more and pee way more and produce way more waste than humans. We have 25 million of them in the state of Iowa. None of that waste is processed. It's literally just bottled and sprayed onto the fields or dumped into the irrigation dike. And one of the results of this isn't just in our local Iowa communities and in other rural areas. This has literally created a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico around the mouth of the Mississippi in the Missouri area, where there is no life because there's so much nitrates and pollution and pesticide pollution as well. That's a huge issue as well. We might not even get into pesticide use. It's just nothing can be there. Nothing, not even little worm, nothing, no jellyfish, nothing lives there for like 100 miles out from the coast where the mouth of the Mississippi River is. That's a direct result of what's happening with industrial agriculture in states like Iowa. I mean, it's a huge, I think the dirtiest industry on the planet is probably fossil fuels. The second is literally meat production. It might even be that meat production as it exists now. There's nothing wrong with meat production. It can happen in a sustainable way, but it is not this, right? Absolutely crazy. Let's see here. It says, CAFOs account for only a small portion of America's 2 million farms, but they dominate animal production and have outsized influence on crop growing, particularly in the Midwest. Again, outsized influence on crop growing. All the crops we grow is almost completely determinate on either ethanol production or production of feed for hogs and cows and stuff. So I've lived in Iowa my whole life. I've never seen a wheat field in the most productive. I've never seen a wheat field in the most rural state to make bread and shit. Never seen a wheat field my whole life. Never seen it. I have never seen apple orchard like at scale for actual like consumption. I have never seen tomatoes grown I've never seen a potato field. I've only seen corn and soybeans. I mean, consider that. I've lived here 30 years, my whole life. Never seen any of that. Let's see. In the early 1970s, U.S. Agricultural Secretary Earl Butz pushed the idea of large-scale farming with the mantra, get big or get out. He wanted to see farmers embrace what he regarded as a more efficient strategy of growing commodity crops such as corn and soybeans. Some farmers invested heavily in buying land and new machinery to increase production, taking on large amounts of debt to do so. A decade later, the farm crisis hit as overproduction, the U.S. grain embargo against the Soviet Union, and high interest rates dramatically drove up costs and debt for family farms. Land prices collapsed and foreclosures escalated. Every blow to independent farming made it more of an opportunity for large corporations to come in, says Partridge. Again, that's like what you saw in the Dust Bowl, right? Very similar process in the Dust Bowl, only it's crazy because the Dust Bowl gets so much historical coverage, even in the Depression, gets so much historical coverage. This you will probably never hear about. You maybe have never even heard of it. And I would wager to bet that its impacts were way larger, way more drastic. I mean, for many decades, and it still persists today, suicides among small farmers are astronomically high, like way, way higher than the average, citizen in a society that has pretty high suicide rates, so this is kind of how it happened, guys. In 1990, small and medium-sized farms accounted for nearly half of all agricultural production in the U.S. Now it is less than a quarter. As the medium-sized farms retreated, the businesses they helped support disappeared. Local seed and equipment suppliers shut up shop because corporations went straight to wholesalers or manufacturers' demand for local vets collapsed. All as those businesses packed up and left, communities shrank, shops, restaurants, and doctors' surgeries closed. People found they had to drive for an hour more for medical treatment. Towns and counties began to share ambulances. This is something I've seen here. We have one large hospital for, I don't know, this whole fucking county, if not several counties. Right? For some of those people, you have to drive well over an hour to get to our hospital here. And as a result, the hospital is probably the biggest employer in our town. So let's see here. So yes, this is how once these small farmers are destroyed, it destroys everything around them too, because that's the basis. The agricultural production is the basis for rural communities and their economies. And then everything shuts down. And then maybe in a town my size, you have a Walmart come in because there's already this trend of things shutting down, and then the Walmart fucking ends it. That's it. And the dollar stores end it. Let's see here. A couple things I want to touch on. So, like when you hear people talk about the negatives about the Soviet Union, they'll talk about Stalin and the Holodomor and the collectivization was really brutal and things like that. But they always fail to neglect the process of agricultural collectivization that's happened here in the U.S. And, it was a hard time in the Soviet Union, the process of agricultural collectivization. I'm not going to try to whitewash that history. I think in the end, it was the best move possible, but it had to be done in such a quick pace due to fears of, the rise of Nazism and the other colonial powers trying to, destroy the Soviet Union. It happened over a period of like a decade or two, and it was incredibly rough on people. Like, I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But a similar process happened here, but it all went into corporate hands. The collectivization there actually helped rural communities. And rural people working the land were actually part of the Soviets that had say over the agricultural process, over the production of the land. It was still the peasants that had say over the land, helped dictate the way communities were going to be developed. Yes, there was oversight from the Communist Party in the National Soviets and the National Congress there that did 5-year plans. Communist societies, socialist societies do 5-year plans, but the peasants that won the land still had control over the land in large scale. And you can read more about this if you want more information on it. I'm not an expert enough to explain. I've read books about it, but I'm not an expert enough to sit here and rail on it. Plus, we're running out of time. That is not what's happened here. It has been turned over completely undemocratically to giant corporations here in the U.S. That has been our corporate collectivization, right? So compare what you hear about Soviet collectivization compared to you hear nothing about it here. Corporate agriculture evolved to take control of the entire production line from farm to fork, from the genetics of breeding to wholesalers in the U.S. or Far East. As factory farms spread, their demands dictated the workings of slaughterhouses. Smaller abattoirs, which offered choice and competitive prices to family farmers, disappeared to be replaced by huge operations that were further away and imposed lower prices on small-scale breeders such as the callbacks. So something here as well, guys, I want to talk about. This is your Monsanto Bayer corporations, and this is a problem on a global scale. So some years back, you really heard horror stories about bioengineering, about Franken foods and things like that, and conspiracy theories around it. A lot of that was perpetuated also by Alex Jones. So the stuff about genetically altering foods, there's a lot of hysteria around it that's not accurate. Like that somehow from this tomato being or corn being genetically altered, it's going to give you fucking cancer or turn you into a mutant or shit. I mean, crazy shit. Unfortunately, like with a lot of conspiracy trends, the conspiracy takes away from the actual problems that are going on. It turns it into this spook-ass weird shit. It's aliens, it's this or that, and it detracts people's attention away from the actual fucking problems. So one of the problems with these genetic manipulators, giant corporations that do genetics for agricultural products and livestock, isn't that it's not necessarily safe to eat or that it's doing some freakazoid shit. I mean, it's not that. It's that these giant corporations like Bayer, Monsanto, genetically alter the seeds and then they own the patent for the seeds, right? And a lot of times they'll make it so that those seeds after a crop cycle or two are sterile. Okay, so for all throughout all of human history with agriculture, farmers would have their seeds. Maybe they bought their first batch of seeds, and then they'd plant them, and then they'd grow the thing, whatever their thing was, and then they'd save some of the seeds from that crop instead of allowing it to go to fruit. And then they'd replant. So they were always able to recycle their seeds, and they had seed sovereignty, crop sovereignty. A lot of ways that no longer exists anymore because the patents for these seeds are completely owned by these giant corporations. And a lot of times they're more prone to crop failure and things like, I mean, you can read more about this. That is the fundamental problem with genetic modification of foodstuffs, right? It's not that it's going to give you the pesticides are going to give you cancer. The nitrates in the water are going to give you cancer. The tomato, because it's been moved around to be a bigger or brighter or redder, juicier tomato, isn't going to give you fucking cancer. That's insane, right? The problem is that now there are no more heirloom crops. Heirloom crops are disappearing, and the ownership of the literal genetic code of the means of production for food is owned by giant corporations. That's the scary shit. It's like Biotechnica or whatever from Cyberpunk or, whatever. Going on here, the buying power of the CAFOs also helps drive farmers' decisions on which crops to grow. Again, we've been through that. Iowa is not alone. Missouri to the south has 23,000 independent pig farmers in 1985. Today, it has just over 2,000. The number of independent cattle farms has fallen by 40% of the same period. Tim Gibbons of Missouri Rural Crisis Center, a support group for family farmers set up during the 1980s farm crisis, says a cycle of economic shocks has blended with government policies. Again, all economies are planned, government policies, to create a monopolization of the livestock industry where a few multinational corporations control a vast majority of the livestock. Gibbons explains they are vertically integrated from animal genetics to grocery store. What they charge isn't based on what it costs to produce, and it's not based on supply and demand because they know what they need to make a profit. What they have done through government support and taxpayer support is to intentionally overproduce so that the price stays low, sometimes below the cost of production. That kicks their competition out of the market. Then they become the only player in town. So tell me, with inflation, especially recently, have you been able to afford meat? I know I fucking haven't. The shit's expensive as hell. It's like $7 for a fucking chub of beef. So logic would tell you that with all these low prices they're talking about here, that would mean low prices for meat. That's that trickle down. That is not what happens, because that is never what happens. When they become the only producer in town, they don't pass that savings on to you. They charge monopoly prices, because if you want meat, if you want produce, if you want fuel, you're paying what we'll fucking charge for it, because we're the only ones that own the land. The farmers don't own the land anymore. They don't own the crops anymore. They don't own the animals anymore. The corporation does. And then they make it so that, coupled with retail upcharge, you're paying so much for fucking groceries. This conglomeratization, this corporatization of agriculture is directly tied to why you pay so much when you go to the grocery store. Facts, motherfucker. Over time, it has extracted wealth and power from communities. We can see how this has impacted rural main streets. I mean, you see it. I mean, these little downtowns. And then here's my boy Nick Shute. What's up, man? If you're watching this, Nick Shute, done some work with him. He's a really great guy. I had one of those Leonardo DiCaprio meme moments when I seen this. I was like, it's him. Anyway, let's polish off this reading here, guys. I know this video is getting long. So this is a quote from Nick Shute. Solidarity, brother. The system has been set up for the benefit of the factory farm corporations and their shareholders at the expense of family farmers. See, my homeboy, he gets it, man. Yeah, Nick. All right. The real people, our environment, our food system, he adds, at the expense of those. The thing that is really pervasive about it is that they control the rules of the game because they control the democratic process. You're sounding militant, Nick, and I love it. It's a blueprint. We're paying for our own demise. The biggest pig farmer in the country is Virginia-based Smithfield Foods. They own Tyson chicken strips. We all eat them, which has nearly 1 million sows in the U.S., Mexico, Eastern Europe. Iowa Select Farms, we actually did an action against them where we piled 100 people in their little corporate office. It was beautiful. Some cop tried to roughhouse me. I pushed him off me, and then he went and picked on some old lady because he was a bitch. Iowa Select Farms has one of the fastest growing CAFO operations in the country, with 800 farms spread throughout half the counties in Iowa. Workers are often poorly paid. Many are bussed in. They often include immigrants has sharpened the criticism from men like Nick Shute, who used to work at Iowa Select, driving pigs and livestock trucks and handling sows. He says he earned $23,000 a year from 12-hour days and no overtime. And this is what they do, is they bus immigrants in. So these same people that are telling you to hate immigrants are the same ones busting them in to take your jobs. Not that you want these jobs, and they work them absolute hellscape conditions. These slaughterhouses are even worse. I mean, if you've ever heard of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, it's even worse than during his time, man. The only thing is it's maybe got a pretty corporate facade now. The high school Nick Shute attended has closed. His daughter was in the last class to graduate as Williams declined. The only doctor shut his clinic and left town. Again, what we're talking about. Shute's mother used to own a restaurant. They closed along with the town's 3 grocery stores. 2/3 of the counties in Iowa, almost all of them rural, have seen their populations decline since 2010, according to the U.S. Census. North of Williams is a CAFO whose name, Quality Egg, has come to represent the worst of factory farming. In 1988, New York temporarily banned the sale of its eggs after salmonella killed 11 people. In 2017, its former owner, Jack DeCoster, went to prison along with his son, Peter, over a 2010 salmonella outbreak that made tens of thousands sick. left some with permanent injuries and prompted the recall of more than 500 million eggs shipped from Iowa factory farms. Quality Egg pleaded guilty to selling eggs with false expiry dates and to bribing an agricultural department inspector to approve the sale. Again, like I said, it's the jungle on steroids. So something with that I want to touch on is, so I'm sure a lot of you probably work in retail and you probably do recalls, right? If you're ever wondering why there's so many fucking recalls now, especially in the last 10 years, for those of you that have been in retail longer than 10 years, I've seen them go. I've worked in retail a long time too. I don't anymore, but I saw the amount of recalls. Like, it went from us having like 1 or 2 recalls a year, even in the last 5 years, to like you'll have that many every couple weeks or every couple months. And that's a direct result of this corporate monopolization. They don't care about safety. I mean, there's literal shit and chemicals that get mixed in, ground up with the chicken nuggets and shit. And it's not properly washed because in the slaughterhouses and the meat processing facilities, they work these people so fucking fast that they can't possibly do it. And they bribe agricultural inspectors. Highly recommend reading The Jungle if you guys haven't. It's 100 years old now, but it's even more relevant. Much of this is the result of agricultural corporations pouring millions into lobbying state governments. But Gibbon says Washington also bears some responsibility. He accuses President Barack Obama's administration of failing to deliver on promised reforms that would have benefited small farmers. This is a keynote here. It says, it is this, he says, that damaged Obama's standing among farmers and drove up their support for Donald Trump. Going back to argument we've had many times on this channel, the liberal class's inability or unwillingness to act on the things they say they're going to act on has driven people into fascism and right-wing populism. That is a fact. I don't care about your opinion about it. It's the same thing happened in Nazi Germany. I'm going to skip some of this here, but we're going to end with a couple quotes here. Investors buy the land and they have tractors and combines that you can run by computer, she said. They'll hire somebody to sit in a little office somewhere and run that stuff off the computer and farm the land that way. Now what you've done is you have lost the innate knowledge of how to grow food and raise animals. You've lost a whole generation of it, probably 2. Now we are going to rely on a few corporations to decide who is going to eat and who isn't. We're 1 generation away from that picture right now. In Williams, Shute says he's seeing a community of owners becoming workers, turning them into peasants, turning them into proletariat. It's going to be like Russia was with serfs. If you want to work on a farm, you'll have to work for them. We'll give you a job, but you're going to be working on our terms. We control everything. Small farms can't survive. Kalbach agrees. I think they're done, she said. Some pretty heavy words to end on here, guys. So yes, one of these things where it talks about you're losing the knowledge, the generational knowledge of how to grow food and produce livestock. And it's like, I don't want to be a Luddite about some of these technological things aren't great and can increase efficiency. This isn't about being a Luddite. But when it comes to anything with automation and industrialization, it doesn't make you a Luddite to ask what we're losing along the way, right? Small landowners working together in collectives with oversight from, national governments that are sympathetic to the peasants and to the farming class can feed the billions of people on Earth. And a lot of studies actually show that small-scale crop rotation, cover crop, regenerative agriculture done, small scale meaning like small parcels done on a huge scale with huge scale oversight, but yet collective democratic decision level at the day-to-day is how we feed the planet and save the environment, okay? And that does not make you a Luddite to say that. And I mean, indigenous people are saying the same thing with land back, right? This is the world that we're creating, is something like Biotechnica or whatever from fucking Cyberpunk or whoever did Soylent Green. I mean, we are heading towards a future where there are no more family farmers, where the land is not controlled by working people like us. It is controlled by giant corporations. And I think Shute put it quite clearly and very, very sharply and poignantly, it's going to be like Russia with serfs. If you want to work on a farm, you'll have to work for them. I mean, that is what we're heading towards, is the emergence, like the name of this video says, of a new peasant class that has no sovereignty of the land, right? And in a lot of ways, you could look at this as a way in which indigenous people and white rural working class farmers and stuff can join together. Because the white workers are getting pushed off the farm too, getting pushed off the land too. And we can build alliances between indigenous people and white farmers that collectively works and advocates and protects the land and the agriculture together. You know, at the end of the day, our enemy is these giant corporations that want to, like I did an article about this years ago called Welcome to the Wasteland in my local paper. I think they titled it, what was it? They didn't title it that because that was a little bit too metal of a name for them. Welcome to the Wasteland. They said, how much is too much? Globe Gazette. You can look it up. I talk about all this too. You know, they're turning this state and other rural states into a wasteland completely owned by corporations, where they're turning it into a desert to produce for industrial need meat and ethanol and food oils. It's an absolute hellscape. And they're all alternatives to this. Like I said, collective management, municipal collective management, small farmers collectively owning the industrial equipment and the shipping lanes and the trucks and the granary silos, and they collectively own through the city or through the municipality or through the county or through their own independent thing, the slaughterhouse and the processing facilities, and they're near them. And then if you couple that with a national program that instigates for cover crops, instigates for, hedgerows and wetlands and things between the forest land, like subsidized farmers to keep that. It is possible. The point I'm making is it is possible to create a different agricultural system that works for everybody. And it doesn't have to be this hellscape future that they're trying to create for us, right? But anyway, guys, I've been going on here long enough. I hope I've given you guys some things to think about. If you're from a rural community, drop a comment. Let me know if you've had personal experience dealing with the consequences or the actions of these things. Let's get a discussion going. What does agriculture in the future look like to you? How do we democratize agriculture? How do we democratize the land? What place does land back to indigenous people have in that process? Let's get a conversation going. Drop your comments. Let me know, guys. I'm going to go ahead and drop this off here, guys, because I'm exhausted. But as always, guys, I love hanging out with you. I love discussing issues with you. And I'll speak with you again really soon. Bye.
Yes, I know.